Hello and welcome to my software process interview series. Back at it with another special guest. I don't know how I find all these special guests, but they all seem to be very special to me. This is Zach, a good friend of mine from Seattle, who I originally met because he was friends with my girlfriend in high school. So, sort of a little roundabout way of meeting, but he's been an engineer for got to be at least 6 years now, around 6 years maybe, working at small startups and big startups. And we're going to talk about big startup today, Airbnb, where he was working on the payments team. Zach, you want to talk a little bit about the payments team and what you were doing there?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I actually just left Airbnb the other week, but I'm here to talk about it. Yeah, I work on the payments team. Airbnb processes a lot of money, as you can imagine, more so than other companies with similar size, just because our main product involves large transactions between two different parties. I worked on the payments team, particularly on the team that collected money from guests. Um, yeah, so anytime you go on Airbnb and you enter your credit card information or pay with a gift card or see a price displayed, that's something that I worked on.
Perfect. Let's get into it. Let's start making a diagram.
Oh, okay, I didn't know we were going to diagram. All right.
All right, can you see this?
Mm-hmm. I'm
All
having
right,
flashbacks
so
to the word interview and the diagram is a
this is actually where
triggering combination for
like
me.
it's good though because I'm the one who does all the work, so you don't need to worry about it. So we start out and someone comes up with some work. All right, what happens next? What do we do when some product manager, or I guess a normal manager potentially, is like, all right, let's implement this thing. What's like the first step of what would happen next?
Sure, yeah, and I actually already disagree with your diagram, frankly.
Oh,
Um,
perfect.
I think, especially at somewhere like Airbnb and on something like payments, you know, we're trying to drive value at the very margins often. So, no one really understands the product super well just because there's so many users and it's such a diverse like space. So often the first step is actually just gathering data and seeing like where are we losing people. So maybe for example, like the checkout page on Airbnb has a 90% conversion rate overall. I'm making these numbers up. I don't know them. But in Brazil, maybe it's only 80%. So step one is that we're actually instrumenting everything we can think of to gather these data and then look um, and see sort
Who?
of just to try and generate product ideas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, who's doing
Not
that?
to say, so the instrumentation obviously is done by the engineers. We'll work very closely with data teams to figure out what do we want to instrument and also like how, you're just always trying to maintain um, that data, which is actually a huge problem in and of itself, right? Because you might be building additional checkout pages, you're migrating things. There's just a lot of churn, so making sure that the data stays clean is a big problem in and of itself. But ignoring that, yeah, engineers are implementing the instrumentation along with the data team, sort of coming up with what data do we need. Once you have that data, then the product teams and the data science teams work together to look at sort of, where are we losing things? What can we improve? What numbers look bad? What numbers look good? Etc. Now, I don't want to say that every decision we made is like that. Obviously, sometimes Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, sends us an email and he says, "We know we have to do this or that." Um, but a lot of our product ideas come from looking at data, just because again, like we don't know what Brazilian users want. We don't have an expert on our 6-person team about Brazil, so we're really making data-driven decisions. You can tell I think a
Okay,
lot about
so
Brazil.
who doesn't think a lot about Brazil? Um, okay, so you have the engineers, they instrument the like payment platform. So you have all these different checkout pages, and then the data team then gets all the data, makes sure that it's like high enough quality to actually be usable, and works with the data analysts, and then together they they reach some conclusion about some work that should be done. Is that sort of what you're describing?
Yeah, I would say data analysts. You could just say product teams. or maybe data and product teams, something like that. The lines are always blurry.
Well, we have the data team over here, so they're certainly
Okay,
there.
yeah, great.
Great. So now, I
So now
guess
you've
right now what we
identified
really have
theoretically
is
a problem or an opportunity. Yeah, you're saying like, oh, this conversion rate is low, this page crashes a lot. Sometimes you find that out. Or maybe even at a higher level, like, wow, we're issuing a lot of more refunds in this particular currency than another currency. Or actually a really big one at Airbnb is customer support tickets. So you might say like, oh, users who check out in this currency in this language are 20 times more likely to call customer support than a general user. So those are kind of the problems that you're trying to identify, or opportunities, however you want to phrase it. And then from there, yeah, exactly. Hypothesis. I think the product manager will own that hypothesis. It's their job to work with whoever they think is best positioned to help them come up with that. So sometimes that might just be them if it's a product thing. For example, like, oh, we don't support this credit card type, and that's why our conversion rate's really low in this particular country because a lot of people use that credit card. Or they might work with a different person who knows more, like, oh, the crash rate for this page is really high. Well, the product manager is not the best position to understand that, so they'll work with engineering to figure out why that might be happening.
was the sort of like the biggest tool comparing between different countries? Was that sort of like the biggest way you would do it to say, oh, like we have good performance here, but bad performance in this other country? That's an opportunity. But were there other like sort of cross sections that were super valuable that you knew about?
Yeah, I think country comparison or currency, just any way you can,
Currency.
what's the word that I'm looking for? Split the data up and compare across uh, different dimensions is really useful. We also did a lot of, someone would have domain expertise about the industry as a whole. So I know like a big thing that was pushed across all of Airbnb, not just payments, is like, I can't remember the numbers, but like, a general travel company will have a 5% contact rate. So 5% of all trips end with a user calling customer support. Well, Airbnb's was a lot higher, especially when I first joined. So we had a huge initiative to drive that down. And then, that comes from the top, and then you eventually gets to your small ass team, and you're saying like, oh, our contact rate for this surface that we own is this, and we need to drop it by 20%, something like that. So I think those are two big ones. And then obviously you have like, you want to be innovative. You don't just want to be trying to bring things up to a standard. So then you have new ideas that you're trying to implement, or things like, hey, no one else does it this well, but we think we can, convert at this rate, things like that. Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge of every company, and especially a big place where you have a lot of opportunities. Like, there's so many things that you can improve on Airbnb. A big challenge is just how do you balance those? How do you decide between, we want to improve Brazilian payments because they're worse than European payments, versus, oh, but we don't have enough engineering resources to do that and rebuild our entire checkout page to be more streamlined. So deciding between those kind of things is something that the product managers do. And I think that's a little bit more of an art than a science.
Yeah, yeah. Especially one thing that you make me think of is there's a big trade-off between trying to, yeah, like bring up the places where you're performing worse compared to just capitalize even harder on the areas that are going well. It seems like in a lot of cases, it's actually better to capitalize on the areas that are going well, but to do that, you have to sort of go step out into uncharted territory, right? Because you
Yeah.
don't even know if it can be done better necessarily, whereas it's obvious that you can bring everything up to the same level. Yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah. You want to let your winners run, I think is what they say in sports and investing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, leaning into areas that you're good at versus improving things that you're bad at, hard to balance.
All right. So we now have a hypothesis. So, and I guess this hypothesis includes like the current state and the expected state, basically,
Yeah. I
or
mean,
like the hopeful
hypothesis
state.
yeah, I might even call it a proposal. A hypothesis to me would, yeah, your hypothesis, if we build this, this will improve.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So after this, there's got to be some kind of prioritization.
Yeah. Um, so the way that our team did it, and um, I don't want to make it seem like we did everything this way because there's, I think on every team, there's always chaos introduced and things that don't go the way you want them to. In theory, the way that we did it is we would have, I'll just describe it extremely literally, we'd have a massive spreadsheet of everything. So um, that spreadsheet might include a tiny thing like fix this text pop up that happens when a Japanese credit card gets rejected, to a massive thing like literally rebuild the entire back end of the checkout system. And those both get a row. um,
Wait, why are you
and
not using like a normal task management like tool?
okay, so well, I will go. My Airbnb imposes Jira on us, imposed, um, and Jira is terrible and slow and extremely onerous to work with. So we would generally do things in spreadsheets and then migrate them into Jira. We pretty much use Jira for ticket tracking, but for prioritization, just so we could have like a top-down, more holistic view of everything that the team might need to work on, we would use spreadsheets. My opinion on Jira could take up another hour. I think it's one of the worst tools in the world.
I'm glad I've never used it then. I don't know anything about it, which is sounds like it's the perfect state. But yeah, imposed from the top, that's always rough. Okay, so every hypothesis goes into this spreadsheet, right?
Yes. Any engineering work goes into the spreadsheet,
Okay, so where
with
would
the
the
exception of bugs.
oh tell me more.
Well, bug management on a team like the Payans team on Airbnb is incredibly difficult. Um, you receive hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bug reports from people who don't know the product very well. Pretty much the only people qualified to figure out if they're valid bug reports or not are the PMs and engineers on the team. Reproducing the bugs can be incredibly difficult because the number of dimensions, like it's, for lack of a better word, it's a gigantic vector space to reproduce the state of the user when they experience the bug. It's also potentially impossible. Like I don't have a Japanese credit card, and it is a lot of work for me to do so. Uh, Bugs might also be totally out of our control. Like maybe the Japanese credit card processor was down that day. So just reproducing and triaging bugs is an enormous amount of work. And then fixing them can also be very difficult, obviously. So we don't track bugs in this spreadsheet. We would just have like, essentially we would dedicate, I think, 2 weeks every quarter to just bugs. And then we had a more complicated process around ensuring that bugs were triaged. Basically, you would do a week of triaging duty on an alternating schedule. And that week you had to triage every bug. Oh, and another thing just to add to the complexity here is like, my team owns some payments pages, but other teams own other things. And some teams on the payments team don't own any user-facing things, but they own the backend systems. And so a bug might get reported to my team because we own the checkout page, but in reality, it needs to be fixed by some other team. And so just reassigning those is a lot of work as well.
Yeah, the bug triage when you have like multiple teams working on a part of a product is such a pain in the butt. That is for sure.
Yes. Yeah, and I think one thing I didn't appreciate until this team is that it's really hard to generate good bug reports. Uh, in the past, I've worked on enterprise products where we had very knowledgeable users, and we could potentially talk to them if we needed to. Somewhere like Airbnb, where it's people maybe use it an hour a month, they don't know anything about the product, which is right, they shouldn't need to, and their bug is like my credit card didn't work. So going from my credit card didn't work to shoot, I have a bad Boolean return value in this function is extremely difficult. And also, you can have 17 different bugs that all manifest themselves as my credit card doesn't work. And so that's another difficulty.
this is getting out of control in terms of the way this is
Yeah, sorry.
organized. But
My brain is
yeah, no, this is what I'm supposed to be able to do. All right, well, I'll go fix that later. All right, let's get back to the main show. Actually, here, let's just send this a little bit of ways away, so we don't need to
yeah, I
worry
think
too
best
much
to
about it.
my final comment on bugs, and we don't need to doesn't need to be on the diagram. It's just that the difference between a bug and a feature, especially in a system like this, is very ill defined,
Oh my
and that's another
gosh,
level of difficulty.
we're sticking it in. Is it a bug or a feature? The endless question. Um, and it's all coming out of this big boy. All right. No, I liked this conversation about bugs. I like talking about bugs. It's a good time. Solving
I
bugs?
find
Not
bugs
as good
very
as talking
interesting.
about them.
I have to say I love solving bugs, given enough time to actually focus on it.
Agreed. Yeah, if it's obviously the most important thing, then you're I can really get into it, even if it's super annoying. But it's hard when it's like obviously not the most important thing. And it's, you know, for me
Yes,
at
I agree.
least.
Like I want to fix this in an hour, and then it's just so frustrating when it continues to take up more and more time.
Yeah. Um, all right, let's get back. I'm also this spreadsheet is also intriguing to me. So we have hypothesis and oh yeah, you said also other engineering work. So we have other
Yes, this is
engineering
important to talk about. So this is totally separate from what we had just talked about, right? Where
yeah.
um, on the one hand, you have Max and I talked about this a little bit beforehand, but I think there's really two massive pillars of work that a team like this is going to own. You have product work, which is what we talked about already, where you have sort of hypotheses and you're gathering data and you're just trying to figure out like essentially how can we make more money, or you might phrase it, how can we make life better for our users, whatever. You're trying to improve the product. Then you have more engineering driven work, and I would say generally this is going to be driven bottom up. So someone like myself is going to say, hey, I'm noticing that we do a lot of this type of product work. And that's really hard because we built the system in this particular way. If we rebuild the system to be more flexible on that dimension, that product work will become much easier. So you're trying to investing in the platform itself to try and make future product work easier, right? Fundamentally, the only kind of engineering work that's worth doing is the kind that makes future product work easier or reduces bugs or whatever. But basically, you're trying to make it so that you're not necessarily trying to make the product better at that moment, but you're trying to make it so that the long term of the product is better. It's easier to maintain, it's more flexible, it's more robust, things like that. And that's generally going to be some engineer will say, "Hey, this is a problem," and then that engineer either will talk to other people on the team and figure out a solution, or maybe they have their own solution. So, like a good example of this would be we have a concept of price items at Airbnb, which is basically like it's sort of the atomic level of how much something costs. So, like a single individual night at an Airbnb is a particular price item. So, a 2 week Airbnb stay might have 50 price items actually, and each one will have a different type. So you have nightly rates, you have maybe a pet fee, you have a cleaning fee, all those things that go into the how everyone gets annoyed when they go from the Airbnb search page to the checkout page and the price goes up. A lot of that is because certain price items don't show up on the search page, taxes, fees, etc. And so an example of one is like, hey, it's really hard to add a new price item type because the system when they built it in 2010, they didn't think we'd be adding them that much. They're like, what do it's a nightly rate. How can we rebuild the payment system to make adding price items really easy? So yeah, we know that doesn't change the product to the user, but it means that in the future we can add price items way more quickly.
So is this basically what happens? Is it just goes straight in this spreadsheet, or like is there? How do you?
I would
Yeah.
say there's this intermediate step here. I mean, for one, yeah, you might want to talk to the PM first and be like, do you think this is worth fixing, or are we never going to do this again? Like maybe you spent a month adding a new bank integration or something, and you're like, wow, that was so painful. How can we make that less painful in the future? And then the PM says, we'll probably never integrate with another bank like that, so it's not worth it. But if they do think it's potentially worth it, just in that you might do that kind of work again in the future, or maybe like, oh yeah, that page is really important. It's bad that it is super slow to load or whatever, or bad that it. Sorry, slow to load would be a feature or actually, in my opinion, it's bad that we can't easily change it or whatever. Then you're going to scope it out. So that is basically you're going to write not a super detailed, but a fairly, you want to investigate pretty thoroughly what would go into fixing this, how hard would it be. I think people talk a lot about t-shirt sizing, which is basically like, it's really hard to estimate tasks at a granular level, but you'd say, oh, this is a small feature, like we could do this in a week, or maybe say, oh, this is XL, like this is a massive project that's going to span multiple teams. Yeah, and then once you have that, then you put it in the spreadsheet. So basically the goal is everything in the spreadsheet has a rough scope, a rough estimate of the impact, and a rough idea of which teams would be involved.
So technically, this high-level design with sizing actually happens before these hypotheses go in as well.
Oh yes, it should.
Okay, great. And then I guess from what you've described so far, it seems like an engineer could just like decide that there's some work to be done and then convince a product manager that they're right and it should be done, and then it would just like go in the spreadsheet. Is that really what would happen?
Yes.
Like there's okay,
yes.
All right, cool.
Especially for smaller things.
Okay, so it's really everything just goes in the spreadsheet, and then there's like the whittling down process happens after. Is that what I'm sort of
exactly.
hearing from you? Okay, great.
The spreadsheet is, I think some people call the spreadsheet the backlog, which I don't know. We had 17 different backlogs, so I'd hesitate to call any individual one of them the backlog. But the spreadsheet is, I think, the list of potential future work.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's go. How do we decide what are the future work to actually do?
Okay. So now you have the spreadsheet. So then before each quarter, we would all get together in a 6-hour-long meeting over Zoom. Very fun. And each row in the spreadsheet has an owner. So that might be the engineer who's driving the project, or it's usually an engineer because we were an engineering team, obviously. Yeah, and so one good thing to notice that every hypothesis that we talked about will have an engineer that owns it. And that's usually someone who understands that part of the code really well. Or maybe it's just someone who's interested in that particular feature. Okay, yeah, so you have this meeting, and basically everyone presents their rows. Okay, actually I skipped a step. There's a lot of steps. The PM will go through all the rows and assign each one. Basically, he's going to come up, he or she, our team was a man, they rank them in relative priority. And they do that by talking to the person assigned. But this is before the meeting. So, you might have like, number one priority is this thing that the CEO told us we need to do. And maybe the number two priority is like, oh, we think there's a huge opportunity. We can make $50 million more every month if we do this. And then maybe, et cetera. And so, yeah, basically you have the spreadsheet and the rows are now ranked by relative priority. Then you get into this massive call, and owners present their projects very briefly. Engineers discuss the resourcing, like, oh, I think you really underestimated that project because there's this complexity that you didn't think about. Ideally, that's happened during the design review before that document that we talked about, but obviously not everyone reads everything because there's just so much.
Wait, so there's a design review?
And sorry, that document that we talked about beforehand, high-level design. Usually you want other people's opinion on that, but you don't always get it, right? Like my team had one staff engineer.
So this is a pretty casual design review process. Okay, cool.
Exactly.
So, take a look at this. Cool.
Yeah, like, do you think this is roughly right? Order of magnitude, etc.
Perfect.
Yeah. So and then once you have this, then we have a second spreadsheet, which honestly, this is a great product opportunity for somebody out there. But our second spreadsheet was literally one row per per week, 1 row per engineer, and you just put a project into each cell. Um,
Wait, 1 column per week, 1 row per engineer?
yeah, maybe 2 columns per week. But yeah, basically, like, what are you going to work on that week predominantly?
Oh my God.
Which of these projects?
This is getting pretty exciting. To decide. So this
So this is
decides, so you decide what everyone's gonna work on, basically.
yeah, exactly. So like, okay, this quarter I was leading a massive re-architecture of the entire checkout system. Well, that's going to take up every week, so that's easy for me, except the weeks where I'm on call. Um, but other
Especially in a
people, particularly
spreadsheet.
more junior, especially other people, particularly more junior engineers, might bounce between a bunch of projects, things like that. I
Yeah.
Do you want me to talk about things that I don't like about this process or not?
Oh, that's exactly what I want to hear about.
Okay, I'm not going to defend this as a good process. This is what we did. It generally kind of worked. One thing I hated about this, so you have that rough design, and one of the things you come up with in that rough design is like your rough estimate. So you have a rough estimate of a rough design. That magically gets translated into a number of engineering weeks. I think there's a book called The Mythical Man Month or something like that. This is truly a mythical man, or this is a mythical engineer day week. Anyway, so you have this totally arbitrary estimate of how many weeks you think it will take, and then our engineering manager and our PM just make sure that that number of weeks is met on the spreadsheet, and then that the project is considered resourced, which is bad, because the estimates are bad, but that's always kind of the case. I think we did get, if people knew their project would be resourced, they did probably put more effort into really having a solid estimate versus something where I was like, I know this isn't going to get done this quarter, so I'll just say it's a big project. And as it gets bumped up in priority, eventually I'll do more thorough resourcing. But beyond that, I think one thing that I really don't like about this process, and this is not unique to the payments team at all, is a project you might say, oh, this will probably take about 10 engineering weeks. And then you get assigned like 5 weeks from someone who just joined the team and is just out of college and has, maybe never written JavaScript before, and there's a bunch of front end work. And now your project is in trouble before you've even started. So, yeah, I think that was a little bit under discussed just because it's a lot easier, especially for engineering managers, to sort of act like their engineers are more fungible than they actually are. I believe it's Personnel. Anyway, I don't know how to spell personnel.
This is probably like the French way.
2 ends.
Yep. 2 ends. Okay.
And then, yeah, so you might end up with, just the quality of engineers, or quality is the wrong word, but just different engineers are good at different things, and
Some
people
engineers are
will.
bad.
Yeah, actually, I will say Airbnb payments team very high quality. I never felt like any, we didn't have any like weak spots beyond just some people are more experienced than others, obviously. But yeah, I think that was a big problem in my opinion. But anyway, so now you've done the spreadsheet.
Ask. Oh, okay. Or wait, yeah.
No,
Let's
go for it.
Go for a hot second. Because where is it? Yeah. This piece always is actually super spicy to me. Who gets assigned to what task? That there's some tasks that are just obviously really good, and some that are obviously really bad, in my opinion. And
Yes.
I just started maneuvering more and more over time when I was in sort of a system more like this, like at Google or something, where I was like,
Yep.
oh, like especially the bad ones, you have to avoid so aggressively if you want to be successful. Do you have any opinions on like how this work went down?
Yeah, I think good and bad is not quite enough variables actually. There's tasks that are really painful to work on, but will get you a lot of recognition. There's tasks that are really easy and will get you a lot of recognition. Like there's at a company like Airbnb, there's a lot of feature work that's super easy. Change this text box.
Yeah.
Do this, do that. And it might drive millions of dollars of revenue. And then you get to say, hey, I worked in this feature and we made another $10 million, even though it took you a day. So that's kind of a good task, even though it wasn't particularly intellectually satisfying. Um, then there's tasks that are really hard or really painful and don't get you any recognition. And then there's the easy, don't know recognition tasks. Like a lot of bugs, in my opinion, fall into like it was easy to fix and no one cared. Um, I think you can pick and choose what you want to work on. I think there's certain people who really go hard for the easy, big recognition tasks. I think that can be really good for you early in your career. Um, but the hard tasks where you get a lot of recognition are really, I think, what drive people's careers forward. Because not only, other engineers know what's hard and what's easy. And so even if you're driving a lot of revenue with things, you'll reach a plateau if you're not doing hard stuff. And also, there's a lot of personal growth in doing hard things. I think the painful no recognition tasks are what people really fight with each other to not do. And I think once you're on a team, people are willing to do that for their teammates. So like, I think on the payments team, we all kind of had at least a very rough sense of like, oh, I did this really terrible task that no one cared about the other week. Maybe you can do it this time, or vice versa. Like, oh, Steve, I remember you did this. I'll do this one this time. But there's brutal fighting between teams to not do those tasks. And I think that's where a lot of corporate dysfunction comes from. And actually, one thing that I would say here, and this alone could be a multiple-hour conversation, is like a huge amount of engineering work goes into teams trying to get themselves out of those types of tasks. So,
just making other work that seems more important?
Or like teams will architect their systems so that they don't have to do that kind of work. Either by taking, like for example, the payments team, and it was a very specific example that, like, we were in charge of storing or pricing information for reservations, which sounds obvious, but actually, payments and pricing is a very different problem space at a place like Airbnb. Anyway, so we had to store this past data, and then by virtue of us storing that, we had to do tons of work for other teams that no one ever was like, wow, great job, transforming that data so that this other team can do their feature. So like we spent endless time, so much time trying to get ourselves out of that particular responsibility of storing this data, even though someone had to store it. It wasn't, if you're looking at a top-down view of the whole company, it made no difference if our services stored it or another team. But I think a huge amount of engineering work goes into teams making sure that their engineering teams don't work on thankless features. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean,
sorry, that was a total tangent to your question.
No, that's really related. I mean, the thing that I find super, or go ahead.
I was just to summarize. I think like within the team, there's not that much infighting over tasks. People generally respect each other. Obviously, there's some jockeying, but a good, at least this, I think I was on an exceptionally functional team, and so we were really good about making sure that people got tasks that were good and bad fairly. But I think between teams, there's a lot of fighting. And a bad team might have a lot. I haven't personally experienced that.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've sort of been interested to see also is when I've been in sort of, this sort of stuff is very specific to when, you have sort of like an ecosystem of teams all working on sort of the same thing, like it sounds like it was the case of payments where you would never have this problem if it was sort of just like one team per like product.
True.
But one thing that I always find interesting is that like your like employee retention is super impacted by this type of stuff, and so it's like that's why it gets so bad between teams, or partly why is because it's like literally life or death of the team whether you can like get the opportunity for career progression for your team. If you can't get it, everyone eventually will leave.
Yes, and my first year at Airbnb before I was in the payments team, we kind of got our most interesting projects stripped and everyone quit. So it's a good point. Yeah, that's why I switched to payments as well.
All right, I'll add, this is life or death for the team sometimes. What a bad text box, but whatever. All right, this is good. This is good, but we got to get back to that second spreadsheet. All right, where is it? I can't. This spreadsheet is really crazy.
Okay.
But okay.
Yeah, back to the spreadsheet. I actually think this is a really effective planning tool, though. I will defend this spreadsheet. As much. What's the quote? There's something about like it's a map. The map is not the terrain, I believe. Um, the map is not the territory. So I think as long as you recognize that this is a map, right? This is not the ground truth of what you're going to work on. But you basically are saying, hey, this is a really hard problem of like a place. There's the coordination problem between engineering teams at Airbnb is really hard, right? Like, okay, you need to build this and we need to build that, and they need to launch at similar times so we can get this out. Or like, oh, you have a dependency on this and we have a dependency on that. It's crazy complicated. If you drew a graph of dependencies, it would, I don't know, I think it might be impossible. It is so hard. So having something where you can tell teams, hey, we're going to try and launch this by this date, and either that will unblock you from doing your thing, or maybe that means we need you to do this before then, is super important. You can't get anything done without that. So you need some kind of deadlines. You need to put things in dates. And then you also, this is the hard part, need to look at that and say, hey, there's absolutely no way that this is accurate whatsoever. Or, you hope it is, but you recognize, like, what do they say? No battle plan survives contact with the enemy. Like, things will not go your way. Maybe some things will go faster, but just by virtue of the fact that a 2-week project can only finish 2 weeks early, but it can finish a lot more than 2 weeks late. So yeah, you have to keep it in context that this is an attempt to plan something, and like any plan, you can put a lot of effort in and try to make it really accurate, or you can kind of phone it in and just hope that it's decent. And there's a hard balance to strike between those two things. But anyway, yeah, so you're trying to generate a schedule so that you can basically tell other teams what you're going to be working on when.
Okay. So now that's
And
like the next step is like you publish it.
yes, exactly. And so that often comes in the form of like me, I work really closely with the pricing team. And I have a good relationship with some of the senior engineers on that team. And so I'll send them a message and be like, hey, we're working on this project together. You're doing stuff on your code. I'm doing stuff on my code. I'm aiming to work on it during these 2 weeks. So if you can do it then as well, that will be easier for us because we'll have meetings and stuff and we'll both be finding problems at the same time. Or just like, hey, I know you're waiting for me to publish this new API so you can integrate with it. I'm going to do that this week. Yeah, so the goal of this is not really to organize your own work, although it's helpful for that, but it's more so that you can coordinate with other teams.
So this first spreadsheet, it's just for a single team.
Yes, this is the pay-ins team, for example. I don't know how other teams did this, to be honest. This is just our team. This was our
And
PM
you don't
driving
actually
this whole
talk.
process.
You don't even talk to other teams until like this point.
Well, the other team's impact goes into their prioritization. Sorry, maybe I should have mentioned that, but there's so many factors.
Okay. So like
So,
way
for
up at the
example,
top. Wait, no, not that high. Like up here, there's like discussion between
that
the
one.
teams.
Other teams' input goes into that as well, yeah. So maybe like,
Yeah.
we need to update this API. A really good example of it would be like we did a ton of API stubbing where like we would change our API and not write any code to support the new API. But that API stub is really high priority because it unblocks another team to start working on the integration, even if the data that we're returning is totally false.
All right. Are we done? Did we do it? No. I want to at least get to the point where someone can start writing some code. So
sure, yeah, I can talk about this forever. So.
Yeah. No, but I want to ask you some qualitative questions. But we
all right,
still
well,
haven't
yeah. So once we have the
so...
spreadsheet, I think we're really close. I will say that. Once you have the spreadsheet, then you talk to other teams. You already said that. Try to coordinate other teams. And then honestly, you're kind of in execution mode. So for some projects, that might mean write code. For other projects, it might mean write a really detailed design doc and have a bunch of meetings where everyone offers their input, and then write code. But essentially, once the spreadsheet exists, the engineers are driving everything. So a lot of the time, that is code. Or realistically, you might read code for a while. But yeah. Yeah, so the beauty of the spreadsheet, I think, is basically that it gives engineers a lot of leeway to then be like, okay, this week I'm doing whatever I need to do for this project. And I think one thing that we were really good at is, I mean, we had a great PM, but I think we were really good at just letting engineers do whatever. Like we didn't have too many detailed check-ins about how projects were going once we did this timeline. It was on the engineer owner to be like to let leadership and other teams know if the deadlines were slipping.
And this spreadsheet, the second spreadsheet, it assumed an engineer would only work on one thing each week or two things each week.
Well, realistically, we know people are doing other stuff on the side, so I think we kind of treated each week as like halftime on this project. But the idea was that you'd always have one main priority, big project. And this is a huge problem at a place like Airbnb and anywhere where engineers just have a ton of work coming into them. Is like, you have a little bit of a like your personal prioritization is that you want to get big projects done, not just because A, because it drives our career forward, and B, because the company wants big things to get done. You don't just want to be in maintenance mode. But you also have tons of daily operational tasks. Like, you want to make sure your service is functioning. You need to do deployments. You're probably triaging bugs. You're probably in tons of meetings. So this was more just to handle the big projects, and people were just assumed to be able to handle the operational stuff themselves without any other prioritization. So yeah, I think like the assumption was this is what you're going to work on, maybe realistically for senior engineers, 15 to 20 hours a week, and the rest of your time is other stuff.
Did you did you feel like the spreadsheet like actually? So I guess things that would happen to me a lot when I was in sort of similar situations is I would get assigned, like you do the quarterly planning and you get assigned like three projects to do. I would always start them all immediately because I wouldn't know what the pace was of any of them. Some of them would be done super fast. Some of them would take forever. I would just start them all immediately and have them go in parallel the whole quarter because that's just what ended up working well for me. But you really felt like sort of going more week by week ended up being super effective. So very interesting.
I think for me, I don't know quite how conscientious I was about this, or if this is just I just always had one big project that I was working on for the quarter that I was the driver of, and then my other time would be working on other people's projects. And so obviously I would focus the most on my own project and would generally be working on that every week, at least a little bit. And then I would let other people dictate what was happening with the other ones. If that makes sense.
No, that's pretty similar to what I did.
Yeah. I think making sure that recognizing when you're owning something versus when you're just contributing to it is a big, super helpful when it comes to personal priorities. And if you own something, then I think basically you're thinking and working on that a lot and having meetings about it pretty regularly.
Yeah. One thing that, ownership is really interesting to me because it almost feels like you can just always take it. Like you don't want to like take it from someone who doesn't want you to take it, but it's always surprised me how like easy it is for you to just say, oh, this is my thing, sort of in any organization. And if you just do a good job, everyone just is like, all right, whatever, like it's yours now. But that's a little bit different. That's closer to like this prioritization stuff up top. But yeah.
No, that's totally true. I mean, just because you're not an assigned owner of a project, once you start working on it, you can become a leader very easily. And then you do often, that means you have ownership. But I think just realizing like, truly, if you want to actually own a project and lead it, it's a lot of work. And so making sure that you're focusing your energy on the right things for yourself, for the company is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I got some more like qualitative questions. So this is like a fair amount of process, I would say. Did you feel empowered to change it? Like if you didn't think it worked for you, did you feel like you could change it and make it different?
Yes. And we came to this process over time. I would say particularly bugs, which we didn't talk about annoyingly or ironically, was the process that I was the most interested in and spent the most time thinking about and we're working on with our PM and manager. The feature stuff, I mean, this is a lot, but we only did this 4 times a year. So really this was 4 days a year of making these spreadsheets. And then actually the rest of the time, I think our process felt fairly lightweight to me, which was really nice. this doesn't, we didn't even get into the day-to-day process of managing Jira tickets and things like that, which is a nightmare in my opinion because Jira is a terrible platform. Um,
Oh man, the hate continues.
but yeah, I think that I actually didn't think this was a particularly heavyweight process, and I thought it was pretty good overall. I think the key thing with this process is you have to recognize that estimates will generally slip just because, like I said earlier, you can only go so far ahead of schedule, but you can get really far behind, and then everything gets pushed. So as long as you have your leadership has to understand that, and you as a team have to come to a collective decision about how much effort do we want to put into making really accurate estimates, recognizing that that will take away time from actually doing the work itself.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
you know,
And then
the,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the only way to do a 100% accurate estimate is to actually do the project. And as you make more and more accurate estimates, you're approaching actually doing the project. So you have to figure out where you want to fall on that graph.
That's something that always has confused me about design tasks. Is like my understanding has always been and continues to be that if you want to do the design, you actually need to figure out exactly what you need to do, which basically is like, you know, I don't know, not 50% of the total work, but like maybe 30 or something like that of just like going through. And there are places you can obviously like just skip ahead and say like, I can figure this out because I found this giant documentation page or like whatever. Um, but it always surprises me that people will like write designs and it's clear they have no idea what they would actually do. And it's just like, I mean, I don't know. Like, it seems like that's actually, now that I think about it, it seems like all of the designs were that way here, where people didn't actually go through like everything that needed to be done and figure out how it could be done. I don't know. Did you,
Yeah, I
what
think
do you think?
one key element of this box is that it relies on your team having a really good working knowledge of the code base already. Um, like often because I was really familiar with a lot of the code. I mean, I shouldn't say really familiar. I was pretty familiar, and I'm a pretty good engineer. So between those two things, I felt like I'd come up with decent estimates pretty quickly. Um, if you're brand new to a code base, then it's going to be very hard, and you're going to have to do a lot more work because you have to read the code to figure out how it works. But I already
Yeah.
knew, I think you begin as part of engineering is just building like a mental model of the code in your head, which is why team turnover actually hurts you so much as an engineering team. Um, is that you lose those, you get so much faster at estimating and rough and coming up with a rough solution as you work on something over time.
Yeah. No, I totally agree that the quality of your designs just goes up so fast as you learn more about, yeah, like the problem space and the code and the existing process, like software. Um, yeah, for sure. And then
Well,
my other,
I'll tell a little horror
okay,
story
yeah,
real
yeah.
quick though about this, which is that I joined the payments team and I was assigned someone who was supposed to like onboard me, and I was going to work with them on their projects. And 2 weeks after I joined, they quit Airbnb, and so I just took over their projects. One of which was do a design document that to redo all of the backend checkout system and present it to the most senior engineer at all of Airbnb, um, who's I believe he is I don't know he's a very famous programmer whose dad has a building named after him at MIT. Uh, And so my first project payments, never having read or written a single line of code on the Airbnb payment system, was to write like a 15-page design document about how we should redo all of it, having contributed zero. Um, and that was a very, very intense project for me that I read so much code and got absolutely destroyed in a bunch of meetings very publicly. But it did make me a better engineer, so I was happy about that. But that was very hard and a good example of a non-casual design process.
Yeah, that sounds very non-casual. Okay, I'll say sometimes casual. Okay, my last question is you said that you did feel empowered to change the process. Did you feel obligated to improve the process? Like, did you feel like a big part of what you were doing was making a good software
Yeah.
development process?
I personally didn't care that much about this process, to be totally honest with you. In that, I thought this was good enough, and I didn't feel like it was worth investing a lot in more. Um, one thing that I didn't touch on here is how much this ban would get changed throughout the quarter by top-down mandates from Airbnb leadership, which was something that was really frustrating to me. Um, like Airbnb is pretty big. I think we had a few thousand engineers, but by virtue of working on a really, really high visibility, high impact area of the product. The CEO and other sort of top executives took a lot of interest in what our team was working on. Um, Not that they were like slacking me, but just they would be like, "Why does the checkout page look like this?" And we own the checkout page. Um, and so we got a lot of randomization. So it didn't feel like worth. It didn't feel really worth our time to invest a lot in this planning process because we just knew that our plans would get changed throughout. So I think one thing that, um, like rather than trying to invest a lot in this process, we invested a lot in trying to figure out what was coming down the pipeline ahead of time so that we could integrate it into our planning. If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. I think randomization is actually such like a toxic thing for people to feel like, yeah, like ownership over the actual process, that it's like if it gets too chaotic, nobody even bothers to improve it anymore, and then from that point it just deteriorates. It seems like that didn't actually
Yeah,
happen so badly to you guys, but it can happen really badly
I
sometimes.
can definitely see that it would happen. I'll say I have complicated feelings about the executive mandates, for lack of a better word. I think as a tech company, you need to have some ability to react quickly to things and to build things out without process. You don't want to be stifled. That's how you end up with like IBM or something. So, um, yeah, I think it's okay that the CEO is like, "Hey, I want to change the product this way. I don't care what else you're working on." To a point, do this, but you can't do it all the time. And so you have like, I mean, that's way above my current pay grade, but figuring out the balance between reacting quickly and overruling process as a leader, um, and respecting, your team's expertise is really hard. And I think as someone who's not a leader at a company, like as an IC, you have to sort of have the emotional capacity to be like, sometimes there's data that I don't know about, or just understand that like part of being an innovative company is taking bets and, not always respecting your own process, even if that can be frustrating. So I tried really hard to not get frustrated about the randomization, but I just knew that it would happen, and that's why I didn't think that this process was super important. Versus bugs, which I think are really important and I cared a lot about, and were a bigger pain than this planning process anyway.
Yeah, I want to talk to you just about bugs now, but no, no, no. But I will say I do disagree a little bit. That it seems to me so much more productive for top executives to be saying, "Hey, like we need to achieve levels of productivity in our software teams that are unheard of. Like that's what we need to do, and you guys need to figure out how to do it." And it's not about you doing this specific change I want to do. It's the number of changes we do needs to be way higher, whether it's the one I want or just any other one that is one of our like many hypotheses. I just think that's such a more productive way of top executives to like put the proper downward pressure on people to be productive, because then you lead to actual improvements in everywhere. Like everywhere there can be an improvement if you have the right kind of pressure, people will actually want to improve, you know. But I don't know. I mean,
Yeah,
I sort
that,
of
that
see
is a
your
really good
perspective
point.
as well.
You're totally right, and I think that Airbnb, the CTO in particular, did talk to about that a lot. Like we need to just increase the velocity. But Airbnb is different than like a Google. Airbnb is one. It's really one product. It's basically 5 web pages, to be totally frank. There's a lot more, but you know, let's be real. It's really 5 web pages and a bunch of other stuff to support those. So uh, even if each web page has 100, you want to make sure that you can force projects that span all the whole product, even which would be very difficult without strong top-down leadership because there's so many teams working on everything, and very very difficult to coordinate ahead of time. Although they were trying to work on that and get better. But yeah, I think your point is true. Like, you know, ideally you want to focus on improving teams' independence and productivity, not forcing them to work on certain things. Um, I don't think we did a good job of that, frankly. I definitely was more focused on the product side because the CEO is a product guy, not a tech guy. But I also just it's nice to have the space to occasionally do things quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's what I got for you today. Thanks so much for taking the time for me, Zach.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks. Good talk to you.